4. They set up camp near a small spring. The spring water flashed in the last light as it poured thinly over smooth rock into a pool at the base of the mountain, and thence overflowed into a narrow stream half hidden by the thick grass of the valley. "There's a little lake a few miles to the south," Miller said. "That's where the buffalo go to water." Charlie Hodge unyoked the oxen and set them to graze on the valley grass. With the help of Andrews, he dragged a large sheet of canvas from the wagon. Then he cut several slender boughs from a young pine, and the two men constructed a box frame, over which they stretched the canvas, securing it carefully and tucking it so that the edges made a floor upon the grass. Then, from the wagon, they lugged the boxes of gunpowder and placed them within the small square tent. "If I got this powder wet," Charlie Hodge chuckled, "Miller'd kill me." After he had finished helping Charlie Hodge, Andrews got an axe and went with Schneider a little way up the side of the mountain and began cutting a supply of wood for the camp. They let the logs remain where they were felled, hacking off the smaller branches and piling them beside the trees. "We'll get the horses and drag them down later," Schneider said. By dark, they had felled half a dozen fair-sized trees. Each returned to the camp with an armload of branches, and they dragged between them the trunk of a small tree. Charlie Hodge had built a fire against a huge boulder, which was twice the height of any of the men, and so deeply creviced at one point that it formed a natural draught for the smoke. Though the fire was blazing high, he already had the coffee pot resting at one edge of the fire, and on another he had set the familiar pot of soaked beans. "Last night we'll have to eat beans," Charlie Hodge said. "Tomorrow we'll have buffalo meat. Maybe I'll even get a little small game, and we'll have a stew." Across the trunks of two close-set pines, he had nailed a heavy straight bough. Upon this bough, neatly hung, were his utensils: a large skillet, 2 pans, a ladle, several knives whose handles were discolored and scarred, but whose blades gleamed in the leaping flame, a small hatchet, and an axe. Resting on the ground was a large iron kettle, the outside black, but the inside gleaming a dull grayish silver. Beside this, against the trunk of one of the trees, was the large box that contained the other provisions. After the men finished eating, they hollowed long oval depressions in the loose pine needles. In these depressions they laid crisscross small branches, and upon the branches leveled the pine needles they had scooped out, so that they could put their bedrolls upon a springy mattress that held their bodies lightly and comfortably. They placed their bedrolls close to the fire, near the boulder. Thus they were partially protected from weather coming from the north or west across the valley. The forest would hold off the weather from the east. By the time their beds were made, the fire had died to gray-coated embers. Miller watched the coals intently, his face a dark red in their glow. Charlie Hodge lighted the lantern that hung on the bough beside his cooking utensils. The feeble light was lost in the darkness. He carried the lantern to the fire where the men sat. Miller rose and got the heavy iron kettle from the ground and set it squarely in the bed of coals. Then he took the lantern and handed it to Charlie Hodge, who followed him to the large box of provisions beside the tree. From the box, Miller removed 2 large bars of lead and carried them to the fire. He stuck them into the kettle, crossing them so that their weight did not upset it. Then he went to the little square tent that Charlie Hodge and Will Andrews had constructed, and took from it a box of powder and a smaller box of caps. He carefully tucked the canvas back around the remaining powder before he left. At the campfire, he knelt beside his saddle, which rested near his bedroll, and took from his saddlebag a large loose sack, which was secured at the mouth by a leather thong. He untied the thong and spread the cloth on the ground. Hundreds of dully gleaming brass shell cases descended in a loose mound. Andrews edged closer to the 2 men. The lead in the blackened kettle shifted above the heat. Miller inspected the kettle and moved it so that the heat came through more evenly. Then, with a hatchet, he opened the box of gunpowder and tore open the heavy paper that protected the black grains. Between his thumb and forefinger, he took a pinch and threw it on the fire, where it blazed for an instant with a blue-white flame. Satisfied, Miller nodded and dug again into his saddlebag. He withdrew a bulky flat object, hinged on one side, that opened to disclose a number of shallow depressions evenly spaced and connected to each other by tiny grooves. He carefully cleaned this mold with a greased rag. When Miller closed it, Andrews could see a tiny cup-like mouth at its top. Again, Miller reached into his bag and took out a large ladle. He inserted it in the now bubbling kettle of lead, and delicately spooned the molten lead into the mouth of the bullet mold. The hot lead crackled on the cool mold. A drop spattered on Miller's hand, which held the mold, but he did not flinch. After the mold was filled, Miller thrust it into a bucket of cold water that Charlie Hodge had brought up to him. The mold hissed in the water, which bubbled in white froth. Then Miller withdrew the mold and spilled the bullets on the cloth beside the cartridge cases. When the pile of lead bullets was about equal in size to the pile of brass cartridges, Miller put the mold aside to cool. Quickly but carefully he examined the molded bullets. Occasionally he smoothed the base of one with a small file. More rarely he tossed a defective one back into the iron kettle, which he had set back from the fire. Before he put the bullets into a new pile beside the empty brass shells, he rubbed the base of each pellet in a square of beeswax. From the square container beside the powder box, he took the tiny caps and thrust them easily into the empty shells, tamping them carefully with a small black tool. Again, from his saddlebag, he drew out a narrow spoon and a crumpled wad of newspaper. With the spoon, he measured a quantity of gunpowder. Over the opened box of gunpowder, he held a shell casing and filled it 3/4 full of the black gunpowder. He tapped the casing sharply on the edge of the box to level the powder, and with his free hand tore a bit from the crumpled newspaper and wadded that into a shell. Finally, he picked up one of the lead bullets and jammed it into the loaded shell case with the heel of his palm. Then, with his strong white teeth, he crimped the edge of the brass casing where it held the butt of the bullet and threw the bullet carelessly into yet a third pile. For several minutes the three men watched Miller reload the shell casings. Charlie Hodge watched delightedly, grinning and nodding his head at Miller's skill. Schneider watched sleepily, indifferently, yawning now and then. Andrews watched with intent interest, trying to impress in his memory the precise nature of each of Miller's movements. After a while, Schneider roused himself and spoke to Andrews. "Mr. Andrews, we got work to do. Get your knives, and let's sharpen them up." Andrews looked at Miller, who jerked his head in the direction of the large provisions box. In the dim light of the lantern, Andrews pawed through the box. At last he found the flat leather case that Miller had got for him back in Butcher's Crossing. He took the case back to the fire, which was now leaping in the flame of a fresh log that Charlie Hodge had thrown on. He opened the case. The knives gleamed brightly in the firelight. The bone handles were clean and unscarred. Schneider had got his knives from his saddlebag. He removed one from its case and tested its edge against his calloused thumb. He shook his head and spat heartily on a long greyish-brown whetstone, whose centre was worn away so that the surface of the stone described a long curve. With the flat of his knife, he distributed the spittle evenly on the surface. Then he worked the blade on the stone in a long oval, holding the blade at a careful angle, and managing the oval movement so that the stone bit equally into each part of the blade. Andrews watched him for a few moments. Then he selected a knife and tested his own blade on his thumb. The edge pressed into the soft hump of flesh, but it did not bite. "You'll have to sharpen them all," Schneider said, glancing up at him. "A new knife's got no cutting edge." Andrews nodded and took from his case a new whetstone. He spat on it, as he had seen Schneider do, and spread the spittle upon the surface. "You ought to soak your stone in oil for a day or two before you use it," Schneider said, "but I guess it don't make no difference this time." Andrews began rotating the blade upon the stone. His movements were awkward, and he could not find the rhythm which would allow every part of the blade to be equally whetted. "Here," Schneider said, dropping his own knife and stone. "You got the blade pitched too high. You might get a sharp edge like that, but it wouldn't last more than 1 or 2 skins. Give it to me." Schneider skillfully ran the blade over the stone, whipping it back and forward so swiftly that Andrews could hardly see it. Schneider turned the blade over and showed Andrews the angle at which he held it to the stone. "You get a long cutting edge like this," Schneider said. "It'll last you near a full day's skinning without sharpening again. You make your cut too narrow, you'll ruin your knife." He handed the knife butt first to Andrews. "Try it." Andrews touched the blade to his thumb. He felt a hot little pain. A thin line of red appeared diagonally across the ball of his thumb. He watched it dumbly as it widened, and as the blood ran irregularly in the tiny whorls of his thumb. Schneider grinned. That's the way a knife should cut. You got a good set of knives. Under Schneider's supervision, Andrews sharpened the other knives. As he sharpened each knife, of a different shape or size, Schneider explained its use to him. This one here is for long work, Schneider said. You can slit a bull from throat to pecker without taking it out of the skin. And this one's for close work, around the hooves. This one's good for dressing your meat down, once the bull's skinned. And this one's for scraping the skin, once she's off. When at last Schneider was satisfied with the knives, Andrews returned them to their cases. From the new movement to which he had been introduced, his arm was tired. From the tightness with which he had held the knives while sharpening them, his right hand was numb. A chill wind blew from the pass. Andrews shivered and moved closer to the fire. Miller's voice came from the darkness behind the three men who sat silently around the campfire. Everything ready for tomorrow? The men turned. The firelight caught the buttons on Miller's shirt and the fringes of his open buckskin jacket, and glinted on his heavy nose and forehead. His dark beard blended into the darkness, so that Andrews had the momentary impression of a head floating above the merest suggestion of a body. Then Miller came up to them and sat down. Everything's ready, Schneider said. Good. Miller drew a bullet from one of the bulging pockets of his jacket. On a flat rock near the fire, he marked with the lead tip a long irregular oval that curved nearly into a semicircle. Near as I can remember, Miller said, this is the shape of the valley. We only saw a little bit of it this afternoon. A few miles on, around this first bend, it widens out to maybe 4 or 5 miles across, and it goes on 20 or 25 miles. It don't look like a lot of ground, but the grass is thick and rich, and it grows back almost as fast as it's cropped. It'll feed a hell of a lot of buffalo. In the fire, a burned-through log fell and sent into the air a shower of sparks that glowed and died in the darkness. Our job is easy, Miller went on. We start our kill with the little herd we saw this morning, and then we work down the valley. Nothing to worry about. There ain't no way out of this canyon except the way we came through. Leastways, there's no way for buffalo. Mountains steepen around the first bend. Lots of places there's nothing up but sheer rock. This'll be the main camp? Schneider asked. Miller nodded. As we work down the valley, Charlie'll follow us with the wagon to pick up the hides. We'll bale them back here. We might have to make a few camps away from here, but not many. When we get to the end of the valley, if there are any buffalo left, we can herd them back up toward here. In the long run, it'll save us time. Just one thing, Schneider said. Start us off easy. My Andrews here is going to need a few days before he'll be much help, and I don't want to have to skin stiff buffalo. The way this is set up, Miller said, there's no hurry. If we had to, we could stay here all winter, picking them off. Charlie Hoge threw another log on the already blazing fire. In the intense heat, the log flared instantly into flame. For that moment, the faces of the 4 men gathered around the fire were lighted fully, and each could see the other as if in daylight. Then the outer bark of the log burned away, and the firelight died to a steady flame. Charlie Hoge waited for several minutes. Then, with a shovel, he banked the flames with dead ashes, so that in the yellow light of the lantern the men could see only the whitish-yellow smoke struggling upward through the ashes. Without further words, they turned into their bedrolls. For a long time after they had bedded down, Will Andrews listened to the silence around him. For a while the acrid smell of the smothered pine logs burning warmed his nostrils. Then the wind shifted, and he could no longer smell the smoke or hear the heavy breaths of the sleeping men around him. He turned so that he faced the side of the mountain over which they had traveled. From the darkness that clung about the earth, he lifted his gaze and followed the dim outlines of particular trees as they rose from the darkness and gradually gained distinctness against the deep blue cloudless sky that twinkled with the light of the clear stars. Even with an extra blanket on his bedroll, he was chilled. He could see the gray cloud of his breath as he breathed the sharp night air. His eyes closed upon the image of a tall, conical pine tree outlined blackly against the luminous sky, and despite the cold, he slept soundly until morning.